Welcome everyone. Here's our Chapter 2 video, which is all about displaying and describing categorical data. As you might recall, categorical data is probably what you thought of as qualitative data in the past. It's things that we can't necessarily take the average of. Instead, things fall into categories. So for example, high school degree, bachelor's, MBA, master's, law, and PhD. Those are all examples of categories for level of education. And then within each category, we have frequencies. So that's what we'll be talking about today. Before we dive into Chapter 2, let's do a quick recap of Chapter 1. So in Chapter 1, we talked about the W's. Primarily, we were concerned with the who and the what. So from now on, the who is what we're going to refer to as our cases. And these are the individuals from whom we are recording characteristics. These can be people, animals, things, anything we want to know more information about. And what we're going to see is that these are often the rows in our data tables. Then we talked about the what. The what from now on is going to be referred to as our variables. And these are the characteristics that are recorded about each individual. And often in our tables, these are going to be the columns. And then finally, we have what's called the population of interest, and this is the entire group with which we are concerned. This is the entire group we want to know more about. And our hope is that our sample will represent the population of interest. So I know a lot of you are visual people, you like diagrams, that sort of thing. So I put together a diagram here that displays some of these vocabulary terms. So let's say that our population of interest is excellent television shows. Maybe we want to know what rating they have. Is it TV 14? Is it PG? Is it MA? We want to know more about excellent TV shows, okay? Well, as you can see in this blue oval, we have all of the excellent TV shows that ever existed in that population, okay? Now, if we're studying all excellent TV shows, how realistic is it to look at the rating of every single TV show? Not very realistic. That would take quite a long time. So what we do instead is we take a sample, and it's in this kind of brownish colored rectangle. We're going to take a sample of excellent TV shows, look at their rating, and then infer about the entire population based on that sample. So within our sample, we have individual cases or individuals. So Tina Belcher here, Bob's Burgers, great TV show. She's going to be our case that we're interested in, and she's a part of our sample, okay? Now for every population, there is a counter population where if you're not in the population, you're outside of the population. So of course, we all know there are excellent TV shows, and then there are really not excellent TV shows, and they are shown here in the red. So when it comes to displaying and analyzing categorical variables, we'll typically start with a frequency table, and we can think of this as making piles. So we can pile the data by counting the number of data values within each category of interest. And we can organize these counts into what's called a frequency table, which records the totals and the category names. I think most of us at some point, whether it was a former math class or history or social studies class, have probably seen this. But in the bottom right here, we have different classes of people who were on the Titanic, first, second, third, and crew class, as well as the number of people who were in each of those classes. And just like frequency tables, we have what's called a relative frequency table. From here on out, if you ever see or hear the word relative, that's just a fancy name for percentage, okay? So before we saw actual counts within this table, how many were in each category. A relative frequency table just shows the percent of people who were in each category. So for example, 40.21% were in the crew class on the Titanic. So frequency tables and relative frequency tables are both ways to show distributions among different categories, and they describe the distribution of categorical variables. So if I ask you to describe the distribution of a certain variable, really what I'm asking you for is what are the categories and then what percent or what count is within each category. So here's an example. Unfortunately, I'm making this video prior to the start of the school year, so I can't use your guys' data. But this is from last year. I had 60 total students in AP Stats, and the question I asked them was, between what two times do you wake up each school morning? So we can see from 5 to 5:29 a.m. there's one person, not a lot of people. 5:30 to 5:59, only one person. And then we go all the way down to 7:30 to 7:59 a.m., which was two people, okay? And then on the right side, I also have the relative frequency. So what percent of AP Stats students woke up within each time frame? A couple of things to note here. When it comes to your counts, obviously, if you are surveying 60 people, you want to make sure that your counts add up to 60. And same thing with your relative frequencies. If you've done it correctly, your relative frequencies, when added together, should be 1 or 100%. So there are a lot of great ways to make some really insightful graphs, but this one, maybe not so great. So take a look at this one. This is displaying that same data we had for the number of people in each class on the Titanic. Sometimes we get a little carried away with trying to make graphs look kind of cool or artsy. What I want you to figure out is what is misleading or incorrect about this graph. Pause the video, take a moment to figure that out. Okay, hopefully you took some time to think about that. I'm sorry that we're not having this presentation in class because this usually generates a lot of good conversation and discussion. But the main thing that people bring up is the area or the space that each ship takes up. Because if we look at the crew, that's trying to represent about 870 people. Whereas if we look at second, that's just under 300, okay? But the size of the second class boat is significantly smaller than the crew class boat, which is why we are, in this case, violating something called the area principle. So the area principle. The ship display makes it look like most of the people on the Titanic were crew members with a few passengers along for the ride. When we look at each ship, we see the area taken up by the ship instead of the length. The ship display violates the area principle, and that means that the area occupied by a part of the graph should correspond to the size of the value it represents. So the issue with that ship display that we just saw is that when we were trying to represent more people within each category, we were expanding both the length and the height of that ship, which increased the overall area too much, right? It was going up and to the side. So what we do to kind of counter that is using bar charts, okay? Bar charts, within a bar chart, the bars are exactly the same width, so that when we're trying to represent more things within each category, we only expand either the height or the width. We're not doing both at the same time. So a bar chart displays the distribution of a categorical variable, showing the counts for each category next to each other for easy comparison. The bar chart stays true to the area principle, and the bars are spaced apart to make the graph more readable. So here we see an example of a bar chart. And again, I'm using last year's AP Stats students data. Here we wanted to know which of these colors do you like the most? Some key features when it comes to a bar graph. First off, you're going to see that there are gaps all the time with a bar graph, okay? Or a bar chart, they're the same. This is different than what we're going to see next chapter, which is a histogram. People mix them up and think they're the same thing. But in a histogram, the spacing here, or the gaps, are meaningful. Whereas with the bar chart, the reason we have the gaps is simply to make it easier to read. And as we can see, the width of each bin or each bar in this diagram has the same width. So red, that width is exactly the same as the blue bar and the purple and the yellow. The only thing that's changing to represent more people within these categories is the height. And you can see that we've labeled our y-axis for our counts, and then our x-axis is labeled as what color do you like the most. And what we have here is not a bar chart, but a relative frequency bar chart. So what I want you to do is zoom back or go back just a few seconds to the previous chart and see what do you notice about the two charts. In this case, our x-axis is exactly the same, right? We have red, blue, purple, yellow, green, orange. That's your color preference. Our y-axis is different though. We have percentages or decimals as percentages on the y-axis. But if you went back to the previous bar chart, you'll notice that they are the exact same shape. So the blue bar is exactly the same height as it was before. Same with the red, purple, yellow, green, and orange. So the only difference when it comes to a relative frequency bar chart is that we now have frequencies or percent frequencies on the y-axis rather than just the counts within each category. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I think we've all seen a pie chart before, but when we're interested in parts of the whole, a pie chart might be your best display of choice. Pie charts show the whole group of cases as a circle, and then they slice up the circle into pieces whose size is proportional to the fraction of the whole in each category. So I took that same data from before. Which color is your favorite? I see that I've very much mismatched the colors. So this red piece actually stands for blue, which is a terrible thing to do. Don't ever do that. But it's very easy to see that blue is the most popular color here, whereas the other ones are not quite as popular. And of course, just like a bar chart, we have relative frequency bar charts. With a pie chart, we can also do relative frequency pie charts. Again, relative is just a fancy word for percent. So here we can display the same data using percentages. One thing I want you to think about is when collecting categorical data, when should pie charts not be used? So think of a situation, maybe a question you would ask, where a pie chart would not be a good option. Take a moment, pause, think about that. All right, so when should you not use a pie chart when collecting categorical data? The main issue when it comes to a pie chart is that it has to add up to 100% or the whole population. So if we have a situation where somebody could fall into more than one category, that's when you don't want to use a pie chart, because then you're going to have the same individual counted in multiple categories. So for example, if we were to ask, what fall sport are you in? That would probably be okay to use a pie chart, because most people, I think, as far as I know, are only in one fall sport. Maybe it's cross country, volleyball, football, tennis, or swimming, or what else am I missing? You could also be in none of those sports, okay? But like I said, you're only going to be in one of those most likely. Whereas if you said, what classes are you enrolled in at Fargo North? Well, for even one person, that one person could be in up to 8 different categories. So that would be a situation where a pie chart would not be useful, because ultimately you're going to add up to more than 100% in that case. So with categorical data, we have also something called a contingency table, and a contingency table allows us to look at 2 categorical variables at the same time. It shows how individuals are distributed along each variable, contingent on the value of the other variable. So going back to that Titanic data that we had before, we already looked at class, which is going to be the top part of our contingency table. But then we could also look at survival. So did somebody live or not live on the Titanic? Again, that's a benefit of a contingency table. You can look at 2 variables at the same time and then analyze how do they interact with one another. So there are quite a few parts when it comes to a contingency table. The first thing we'll talk about are the margins of the table. And we have that on the right side in this orange oval, and on the bottom, both of them are labeled with total, okay? So the marginal distribution, these are going to be the far right column and the very bottom row of our contingency table, okay? So the marginal distribution of survival is exactly what I have circled in orange here, okay? So we see that altogether, no matter what class you were in, 711 people were alive in the Titanic, and 1,490 died in the Titanic. Same thing for our marginal distribution of class. We could say that in all, 325 were first class, 285 were second class, and so on. So if I ask you to talk about the marginal distribution, I am only interested in the totals for the columns or totals for the rows. Also, when it comes to contingency tables, we have what are called cells, and each cell of the table gives the count for a combination of values for our two variables, okay? So for example, this oval, orange oval of 673, that means that 673 people were on the crew and they died. So that means of all the crew members, 673 died, and of those who died, 673 were crew members. So it allows us to look at that intersection between two of our variables. So in our contingency table, we can also look at something called a conditional distribution. And a conditional distribution shows the distribution of one variable for just the individuals who satisfy some condition on another variable. So for example, maybe we only want to look at those who lived on the Titanic, okay? So we saw before we had living and dead. We also had first, second, third, and crew class. Well, here in this conditional distribution, we are only looking at those who lived. So given that they lived, we want to know what percent were in first, second, third, and crew class. And we found those here. This 28.6% can be found by taking 203 divided by our total, which is 711, and same thing for the other classes. So a conditional distribution, that is where you look at just one row or just one column of your contingency table, then analyze the other variable in that row or column. So let's look at that same distribution, except now we're only going to look at those who died. So only 8.2% of people who died were in first class, whereas if we look towards the right of this table, 45.2% of people who died were in the crew class. Maybe you're noticing something a little unfair here. So we just found two conditional distributions. One was for those who lived on the Titanic, and one was for those who died on the Titanic. And yeah, it's somewhat insightful to look at two conditional distributions side by side in a table. But what really is eye-opening is if you put them in something like a pie chart, okay? So if we look here, let's just look at, so on the left we have those who lived based on their class, and then we have those who died separated by their class as well. We can see very significant differences in the sizes of these pieces, okay? So for example, if we look at the extreme for first class on the left side in the alive, that's a pretty significant chunk, right? I mean, it's a little over a quarter. Whereas if we look at those who died, that's a very, very small green sliver on the right pie chart. If we compare that to the crew or the third class, maybe let's look at third class, that's kind of this purple color. For alive, that's maybe a quarter of the people who were on the Titanic were third class and lived. Whereas if we look at the dead, that's probably about 1/3 of people who died were also a part of third class. So a benefit of displaying things in a pie chart, or any display for that matter, is that you can easily compare conditional distributions. Here we see that first class people survived much more often compared to the lower classes. So what did those two pie charts tell us? Well, we saw that the distribution of class for the survivors is different than the distribution of class for the non-survivors. This leads us to believe that class and survival are associated, or in other words, that they are not independent of one another. So by definition, independence is when the distribution of one variable in a contingency table is the same for all categories of the other variable. So looking back at those two pie charts, what this means is that if class and survival were independent, the size and proportion of each piece in the alive pie chart would be the same as that in the dead pie chart. However, we saw that there were significant differences, and that would indicate that they are not independent of one another. In other words, by knowing that someone was in the third class, for example, we know that their survival chances were much lower than somebody who was in the first class. So when you're trying to figure out if two things are independent or not, you can think about, does the outcome of one variable determine the likelihood of the outcome of the other variable? In this case, pretty clear. If you were a higher class person, you were more likely to survive, whereas if you were lower class, you were less likely to survive. This might be the one type of categorical data display you've maybe not seen before, but it's very similar to a pie chart. It's called a segmented bar chart. So segmented bar charts are just like a pie chart, except now the bar is the whole and each part is proportional. So like we had a pie, a circle with different pieces in it, we have that same thing now with the segmented bar chart, except the entire rectangle is our 100% piece, and then we break that 100% up into different segments that show the proportion of each category. So what I'd encourage you to do is go back, take a look at the pie chart for those who lived and those who died, and then see if you can see the connection between the pie chart and the segmented bar chart of this data. And a final note, if you are comparing groups that are of different sizes, you know we talked about relative frequency displays, you definitely want to use relative frequency displays when you're comparing groups of different sizes.